I was recently talking to an expat who had lived in Tokyo for 2 decades, and he told me about this time he left his wallet on a crowded subway platform. He didn't panic. He didn't even hurry back. He knew that in a city of, 14 million people, that wallet wouldn't just be there. It would likely be handed to a station attendant with every single yen accounted for. He called it the ultimate freedom. But then our conversation shifted to the morning headlines. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff had just announced they were moving a segment of their maritime border southward. They called it a pragmatic correction to avoid conflict. To the rest of the world, it looked like, sensible crisis management. But my friend reacted as if he'd just seen a crack in a dam. "You don't get it," he said, and his tone was suddenly sharp. "The reason my wallet stays on that bench isn't because of kindness. It's because here, a line is an absolute. It doesn't move. Not for convenience, not for de-escalation, and certainly not for pragmatism." It made me realize that we are witnessing a profound split in how civilizations survive. On one side, you have the modern liberal approach, redrawing lines, softening laws, and adjusting boundaries to keep the peace. On the other, you have Japan's psychological Great Wall, a lattice of unyielding social and physical red lines that most outsiders find suffocatingly rigid. While the West experiments with the decriminalization of disorder and the blurring of borders, Japan has made a radical choice. They would rather shrink, age, and stagnate than move a single inch of their fundamental boundaries. It raises a haunting question: is the flexibility we praise actually a symptom of decay? And is Japan's obsession with the immovable line the only thing left keeping the chaos at bay?
That whole story, the contrast between the return wallet and the unmoving border, it perfectly isolates the core tension we need to analyze today.
Right. It's the micro and the macro telling the same story.
Exactly. What we're looking at is a society that has strategically chosen stability and internal order, and they've achieved that through this extreme cultural and institutional rigidity.
And they've chosen it over things that modern liberalism really champions, like economic dynamism and, demographic flexibility.
That's the trade-off right there. So our mission in this deep dive is to explore the specific structures, the cultural norms, the political decisions, the historical accidents that actively enforce this immovable line approach in Japan.
Especially when it comes to things like immigration and social cohesion.
Especially then. We want to understand not just what Japan does, but why these policies, which are so costly, still persist. So to do that, we'll be using the analytical lenses of historical institutionalism and identity politics to give you a really thorough, layered understanding of this complex national choice.
Okay, let's unpack this. If this Japanese line is truly immovable, if it's so absolute that people won't cross it even when nobody is looking, then it has to be built into the very, the operational code of social life.
It has to be.
This incredible rigidity, this sense of collective obligation, it doesn't start with a piece of legislation or some government decree.
No, it's instilled almost from birth.
Exactly. I saw this piece of sociological research that pointed to a parenting technique that is so simple, but so deeply profound.
Mm.
When a child misbehaves, the parent doesn't say, "God is watching," or "that's against the law." They just ask, "Do you see anybody else doing that?"
Ah, right. The group is the reference point.
The message is just chillingly simple. The act of being noticeable, of standing out from the collective, that is the actual offense. It suggests your existence, your behavior is fundamentally for everyone, not just for yourself.
And that framing existence for the collective is the perfect way to get into the fundamental social duality that really defines Japanese communication, hon-ne and tatemae.
Right, the true sound and the facade.
Exactly. Hon, the true sound, that refers to a person's authentic, often messy feelings and desires. These are things that often go against what society expects, and so you keep them hidden. You only share them with your absolute closest friends.
And then there's tatemae.
And then there's tatemae, which literally means built in front. It's the public face you wear, the appropriate behavior, the opinions, the demeanor that are required by society or by your specific role in a group.
So it's not just being polite. It's more like a necessary form of social armor.
It is so much more than politeness. Tatemae is a structural necessity. It often requires you to be deliberately ambiguous or to even tell what we'd call white lies.
All to avoid conflict.
Specifically to prevent confrontation, disagreement, any kind of discord. The stakes are just profoundly high because public failure, losing face, or being the source of disapproval. It's catastrophic in Japanese culture. It leads directly to shame and a huge reduction in your social standing.
The prime directive is to maintain harmony or wa.
At all costs. Failing to do so is seen as this act of profound aggression, almost an insult against the entire group.
It sounds like a constant, low-level internal war, between who you actually are and who you have to pretend to be.
And that psychological cost is precisely why the conflict between hon-ne, your true desire, and giri, your social obligations, has been the main thing explored in Japanese drama for centuries.
The classic story of love versus duty.
Exactly. The samurai torn between his true love and his duty to his lord. And the modern implications are just as severe. We see young people struggling with the sheer emotional burden of managing this rigid split.
Which leads to things like hikikomori.
Extreme social withdrawal, yes, or the parasite singles, adults who just delay independence because they can't face the pressure of navigating this rigid social structure.
So that distinction between the internal truth and the external mask, that leads us to the next, maybe even more foundational concept, uchi-soto, inside versus outside.
Uchi-soto, yes. It's the core operational principle. The distinction between your in-groups, your uchi, and all other out-groups, the soto. And this isn't some vague sociological idea.
No, it's baked right into the language.
It is immediately reflected and encoded in the language itself, specifically through the honorific speech system, keigo. The very existence of keigo proves that this distinction isn't optional. It's mandatory for just getting through the day.
And what makes it so tough for outsiders to grasp is that these circles, uchi and soto, they're fluid, right? My family is uchi, but when I talk about them to my company colleagues, they might suddenly become soto.
Absolutely. The groups overlap, they're context dependent. Your company is an uchi, your family is an uchi, your karate club is an uchi, but your position shifts instantly based on who you are talking to.
And the rule is always to elevate the outsider and humble your own group.
That's the core rule of interaction. When you're addressing a member of an outgroup, a soto member, you have to elevate them, honor them, and at the same time, you have to humble the uchi member, which usually includes yourself.
Can you give us a concrete example with the language? With keigo, it just shows how automatic this line drawing is.
Sure. Let's take a simple verb, to see. In its plain form, it's mirror. With keigo, you have two key forms, humble language and respectful language.
Okay.
If I'm talking to an outsider, a soto person, about myself or my subordinate, my uchi, I use the humble form, haiken suru, to humbly see.
Got it.
But if I'm talking to that same outsider about them or someone in their group, I have to switch. I use the respectful form, goran ni naru, to respectfully see. The verb choice is this instantaneous tactical realignment based purely on that shifting boundary line.
And this plays out constantly in the workplace.
The workplace is the clearest example. A manager uses casual speech with his subordinates. They're his uchi. But if he's speaking to another company, an outsider, a soto, his entire company, even his own boss, instantly becomes the uchi for that conversation.
So he drops the honorifics for his own people.
He has to. He omits them because he must present this unified, humbled front to the external entity. It shows his company as one internal unit.
That's a perfect illustration of the mental architecture you need to maintain that immovable line. And the same logic applies to simple social rituals at home, right?
Yes. The home bathing ritual is very telling. Normally, the most senior family member bathes first. But if a visitor is there, they are immediately offered the first bath. The best sleeping arrangements.
It's an act of honoring the soto member.
Right. And this is where Westerners get so confused. We're taught to politely refuse anything that inconveniences our host.
Oh, no, I couldn't possibly.
Exactly. But in the Japanese context, to refuse the first bath is a social failure. You're actually dishonoring the host's attempt to honor you. The rules of engagement are absolute. They can't be broken, even for what you perceive as politeness.
So this intense, enduring etiquette, where did it all come from? This high formality, this collective focus?
This is where we bring in historical institutionalism. These rules, they likely developed from centuries of a top-down, highly stratified, class-based feudal society. The Tokugawa Shogunate.
Where stepping out of line wasn't just rude, it could be fatal.
It could lead to severe repercussions, yes. So absolute adherence to rigid formality became a survival mechanism. High formality was born out of avoiding death or social ruin. And we have to remember, we're only a couple of generations removed from a time when that absolute deference was completely non-negotiable.
But the enforcement seems to go beyond just social pressure. It sounds almost, spiritual, internally policed.
It definitely moves beyond simple law or Confucian obedience. Etiquette is reinforced by this persistent phrase, "the sun is watching."
Which is like saying, God knows.
Culturally, it's the same thing. It's not about one single punishing deity, but this deep polytheistic belief that everything in nature, the mountains, the water, the sun, is conscious and observing.
So the moral constraint is internal. Am I behaving in a way that lets me walk proudly in the sun?
That's it. And that shifts adherence away from fear of external punishment to an internal, rational decision to stick to an ethical framework. The rules are internalized, so you follow them even when no human is looking.
And then there's the theory that the physical geography of Japan itself played a role in institutionalizing this strict rule following.
Yes, the geographical context is often, I think, underestimated. Japan gets 18 to 20% of the world's major earthquakes, magnitude 6 or above.
On just a tiny fraction of the world's land area.
On 0.25% of the land area. This high frequency of devastating natural disasters has, arguably, ingrained a psychological and historical need for absolute, rigorous rule following. It's for the survival of the group.
If everyone follows the emergency rules perfectly, more people survive.
The group maximizes its chance of survival without relying on anyone else. This centuries-long acclimatization to dealing with crisis alone institutionalized the idea that homogeneity and rule following are synonymous with national survival. And that mindset is why changing immigration policy feels like a physical threat to security, not just an economic calculation.
It's clear the invisible hand of culture is powerfully at work. But these rigid rules, they didn't just survive by accident. They were actively institutionalized through political choices, which set up this powerful path dependency that still defines modern Japan.
And that story really begins with a strategic choice of isolation.
The Sakoku, the closed country policy.
Right, from the Edo period, 1603 to 1868. And this was not just an economic decision, it was driven by a deep, almost existential fear of foreign influence.
Western military and religious threats, specifically.
Yes, threats to Japan's political stability and its very rigid social order. For 265 years, this policy enforced not just isolation from trade, but it even prohibited Japanese citizens from traveling abroad. This unprecedented duration of institutional isolation cemented a profound aversion to external influences. The immovable line wasn't just psychological, it was codified into law.
So when the gates were finally forced open in the Meiji Restoration, Japan didn't crumble. It modernized, but completely on its own terms.
Exactly. The Meiji leaders understood that to avoid being colonized, they had to adopt Western institutions and technology. But their approach was regulated. It was highly selective.
The mission was to strengthen the nation.
To strengthen the nation against external forces while simultaneously fostering an even stronger sense of national identity and unity. Modernization served the nation. The nation did not compromise its identity for modernization. That selective adoption was the next key step in institutionalizing this insular nationalism.
And this brings us to the post-World War II period, which is just the critical juncture for understanding this modern path dependency, while WWII was this shock that forced Europe toward integration.
Japan used its reconstruction to reinforce its isolationist structures. This is the core application of historical institutionalism to modern Japan.
Because they didn't have the same problems as Europe.
Unlike European nations like Germany and France, which faced crushing labor deficits after the war, Japan's post-war labor force actually grew robustly.
Can you give us the specific numbers? Because they really illustrate this total reliance on domestic resources.
Certainly. Before the war, in 1939, Japan's labor force was around 34.5 million. By 1950, it was 33.4 million, a small dip. But then, crucially, by 1965, the labor force had just exploded to 64.4 million.
Where did all those workers come from?
You had a massive baby boom, a successful shift of millions of workers from agriculture into heavy industry, and the reabsorption of soldiers. They had more than enough domestic human capital for their economic miracle.
And Europe.
Contrast that with Germany, whose labor force fell from 25 million to under 22 million. Or France, which also shrank. They were desperate for workers.
So Japan solved its post-war reconstruction crisis without needing foreign workers. And that success, ironically, became its institutional constraint today.
Precisely. This reliance is the core mechanism of historical institutionalism at play. Because the crisis was solved domestically, the institutional preference for homogeneity was never challenged.
It created a path dependency.
A deep structural path dependency, where restrictive immigration policies were just maintained as the default. It locked in this preference for national unity over foreign labor. And the conservative Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, which has governed almost continuously since the war.
They just aligned with public sentiment.
Naturally, they used this established framework to easily oppose any substantial policy changes that would favor mass migration.
This means that while Japan strengthened its insular nationalism, the same post-war devastation forced Europe down a completely divergent path, a truly critical juncture.
It was. The devastation in Europe fostered this massive collective revulsion toward extreme nationalism. It led directly to the founding of what would become the EU, emphasizing cooperation and collective growth. And that commitment required institutionalizing ways to manage increasingly diverse populations.
Yeah, the practical outcome of that, especially in Germany, couldn't be more different from Japan.
Germany had a severe labor deficit. They addressed it with the Gastarbeiter, or guest worker, policy in the 1950s. They were intended to be temporary.
But they stayed.
They settled permanently. By the early 70s, over 2.6 million workers, mainly from Turkey and Southern Europe, had fundamentally altered Germany's demographic makeup. France did something similar with its 1945 ordinance, bringing in workers from former colonies.
So, to sum up this historical divergence, European nations built institutions that facilitated migrant labor, which created a future need for integration policies.
While Japan did the opposite. It institutionalized the immovable line, making it structurally difficult, if not impossible, to adapt later. The Japanese system became defined by the absence of a crisis that demanded foreign labor. And that allowed the cultural preference for homogeneity to harden into policy, creating this powerful path dependency that still defines every immigration debate today.
We've established the cultural and institutional foundations for this immovable line. But this rigidity has forced Japan to accept a staggering price. The reality of a rapid demographic contraction. People call it an elegant decline, but the scale of the crisis is immense.
The demographic situation is beyond critical. Over a quarter of the population is already over 65. That figure hit 28.7% in 2021.
And the projections are grim.
They show the population will likely decrease by 20 million by 2045. By then, over a third of all residents will be elderly. And the total fertility rate, it just keeps sliding down, proving that the government's attempts to, encourage Japanese women to have more babies just didn't work.
And the physical signs of this aging are so concrete and sobering.
They really are. They're powerful markers of a civilization physically retracting. The fact that sales of adult diapers officially surpassed sales of baby diapers back in 2014, that's a poignant statistical shift.
And schools are closing.
Structurally, the country is dismantling its future. Roughly 400 primary and secondary schools close every year because there are no children left to fill them. And those buildings are immediately repurposed, converted into care facilities for the elderly. It is the physical retraction of an entire civilization happening right in front of us.
And the usual policy responses, boosting birth rates, getting more women into high-paying jobs, they've all failed because they run headlong into that rigid cultural line we talked about.
Correct. Despite major policy initiatives like the Angel Plan and the New Angel Plan to improve childcare, the TFR just kept dropping. And efforts to boost female workforce participation always hit the M-shaped curve phenomenon.
Where women leave the workforce for family care.
They feel culturally obligated to leave, and if they return, it's to lower-paying part-time jobs. This shows that the cultural gender roles, the need to maintain harmony and traditional duty-giri are stronger than the economic necessity that's driving policy.
But wait a minute. If the cost of this rigidity is economic stagnation and a shrinking workforce, doesn't that fundamentally undermine the social integrity you claim it protects? I mean, isn't the wallet safe today only because the economy is in decline tomorrow? This sounds less like stability and more like a beautifully preserved antique that's running out of air.
That is the ultimate challenge to the system, but it also leads us to the sociological defense for their choice. This concept of the mobility window. Japan has structurally chosen to maintain low mobility.
What does that mean exactly?
When social and physical mobility is low, people stay parochial. They accept a clear economic penalty and opportunity cost by avoiding the wider market or paying more for local goods. But the reward is the safety of deep relational interaction. That high level of guaranteed trust, the returned wallet, that is the currency of a low mobility equilibrium.
And the risk for highly mobile societies, like in the West, is the collapse of those relational constraints.
Precisely. When mobility gets too high, you operate on the assumption you'll never see the other person again, so the need to maintain a good local reputation just collapses. This is where small acts of disorder become widespread.
Like fabricating online identities or leaving fake 5-star reviews.
Exactly, because there's no social penalty for dishonesty. The relational constraints are gone.
And that structural decay leads to a low-trust equilibrium.
It does. High mobility risks driving a society toward what some sociologists call a nasty, brutish, and short environment where nobody trusts anyone. Japan's immovable line is a functional defense mechanism against that slide. They accept the shrinking economy, the massive public debt, which is staggering, over 250% of GDP, as the acceptable price to protect their high-trust, low-mobility equilibrium. It's a strategic rejection of the Western path.
And this structural safety is linked to a cultural value system that historically prized skill over just making money, the Shukun philosophy.
The artisan, or Shukun philosophy, is foundational to this unwavering commitment to quality. It demands absolute perfection, even in unseen details a customer might never notice. And this commitment is ancient. It was formalized in the social hierarchy of 17th century Tokugawa Japan. Artisans were ranked third above the merchants.
Which shows they valued the makers more than the traders.
It reflects a core societal value that prizes the producer of tangible, high-quality goods, the master of a skill, more than the person who merely facilitates trade.
And the way that skill is passed down reinforces the rigidity. It rejects standardization for intense embodied practice.
That's the key. The knowledge isn't in a manual. It's transmitted through decades of intensive, often ritualistic apprenticeship. An apprentice might spend a year just mastering menial tasks like squeezing towels or washing rice to impossible standards before they're even allowed to touch the actual materials. This demanding, uncompromising discipline, that is the philosophical essence of the immovable line applied to work.
Okay, so this cultural and institutional rigidity, it leans heavily on this powerful narrative of ethnic homogeneity, the idea that Japan is this pure, unified state. And that narrative is the core engine of the identity politics that justifies restrictive immigration policies.
And this is where we really need to apply that identity politics lens, because scholars are increasingly clear. The notion of Japan's ethnic homogeneity is functionally a myth. Historical evidence shows diverse origins. Waves of immigration from China and Korea up to the 9th century. I mean, in the ancient capital of Heian, now Kyoto, maybe a third of the noble clans were of Chinese or Korean descent. And then you have the long history of discrimination against groups like Japanese South Americans or long-term non-Japanese residents like Koreans and Chinese who were denied equal rights for generations.
Yet, the official state machinery seems committed to reinforcing this manufactured purity.
They absolutely are. The institutional preference is strong. For example, official statistics categorize biracial citizens only as Japanese. There is no official option for multiracial status.
So they're literally erasing diversity from the data.
It's an institutional silence that reinforces this preference for perceived homogeneity. And public reaction mirrors this. Think of the backlash around biracial Miss Japan champions, or that notable incident where the tennis star Naomi Osaka, who has Haitian heritage, was portrayed with noticeably lighter skin in an ad. It highlights a profound discomfort with uncommonness.
Now, let's address the elephant in the room. The widespread social anxiety that more immigration has to lead to a collapse in security and a rise in crime. Dissolving that high-trust society. We have to look at the hard data here.
We can, and we can use the 2022 Ministry of Justice data to provide a direct statistical rebuttal to that anxiety. So in 2022, foreigners were 2.2% of the population, but they accounted for 4.7% of all reported crimes.
Okay, so if you stop there, it sounds bad. It validates the fear.
If you stop there, the narrative that foreigners bring disorder would appear validated. But we have to make the critical distinction between legal foreign residents and non-residents. That means visiting foreign nationals, tourists, technical interns, and overstayers.
And when you isolate the integrated legal population, what does the data show?
The picture reverses completely. When you exclude the non-residents, foreign residents accounted for only 1.7% of crimes, while being 2.2% of the population.
Wait, say that again?
1.7% of crimes, from 2.2% of the population. This means that legal foreign residents are statistically more law-abiding than their Japanese counterparts.
Wow.
If we look at the per capita data, per 100,000 persons, Japanese residents had about 143 arrested persons. Foreign residents had a significantly lower rate of 120.
I have to stop you right there. That is a profound finding. You're telling me that factually, the foreign residents, the people that immigration critics claim are eroding the social order, are actually more law-abiding than native Japanese.
That's what the Ministry of Justice data shows.
We need to just linger on that because that totally demolishes the common narrative that increased legal migration necessarily equals increased social disorder.
It fundamentally reframes the entire issue. The crime stats show that the immovable line isn't protecting Japan from its resident working population. It's protecting it from the chaos associated with high mobility and non-residents.
The transient populations.
Yeah. The non-residents commit a vastly disproportionate number of crimes. 5,000 of the 8,600 foreign-committed crimes in 2022. And what makes this really stark is that the spike happened during a year when tourist entries were heavily restricted because of COVID. It suggests their per-day crime rate is exceptionally high.
And we should also note that a lot of the crimes recorded against foreigners are non-violent administrative offenses, right?
Exactly. A huge number of these are immigration-related, like visa violations or program infractions. And while they are legal offenses, they don't correlate to public safety concerns like theft or violence that feed the general anxiety. The data indicates the fortress is not protecting against established residents, but against the instability of transient populations.
And this friction can be made worse by seemingly good policies, like the generous MEXT scholarship.
This is a perfect example of how identity politics is fueled by perceived resource allocation. The MEXT scholarship attracts high-achieving foreign students, about 4,500 a year.
And it's a good deal for them.
It's very generous, unbonded, includes airfare, tuition, a living allowance. But when you break down the spending, the amount per MEXT student is more than 5 times higher than what Japanese students get on comparable loan-free scholarships. This discrepancy, regardless of the policy's intent, fuels domestic contention. It reinforces the perception that the government is spending disproportionately on outsiders at the expense of the in-group.
The psychological cost of this immovable line isn't just borne by the compliant citizens inside the fortress. It's also borne by those trying to bridge the gap, whether they are immigrants trying to enter Japan or, perhaps more surprisingly, Japanese nationals who have emigrated abroad.
When Japanese nationals move to a highly diverse society like the United States, they often maintain what's called a transnational identity. They might live there for decades, but many refuse to abandon their Japanese passports.
Which is a big deal since Japan doesn't allow dual citizenship.
It's a significant choice. And this stubborn retention of Japanese identity, it's a function of coming from a highly homogeneous, low-context communication society, and then being dropped into the diverse, high-context society of the U.S.
And this creates immediate psychological friction because their internal status just doesn't match their external reality.
Precisely. They arrive often having held a position of cultural privilege in Japan, but in the U.S., they are immediately categorized as Asian immigrants. This challenges their internal perception of themselves as long-term residents or expatriates, a term they often feel is reserved for Western white populations.
So there's a loss of status?
A loss of perceived social status, compounded by this external label of minority. It creates an extra layer of psychological burden and cultural disorientation.
And this burden exists even when they achieve high economic success. The cultural narratives in the U.S. can actually work against their mental health.
That is the insidious nature of the model minority myth. Even with high average household incomes, around $74,000, and high English proficiency, Japanese immigrants are not immune to profound psychological stress.
How does the myth hurt them?
The myth normalizes exceptional success and minimizes their real struggles. It sets an impossible standard for what Asians deserve. This ultimately helps maintain the existing system of privilege and actively pits minority groups against each other, which increases their isolation. It's why psychological disorders are disproportionately high among Asian populations.
So this cultural gap moving from low-context Tokyo to high-context, racially charged America is why the theory of social capital becomes so relevant, especially the difference between bonding and bridging.
Bonding is natural and easy. Developing relationships within your own group with fellow Japanese immigrants, that provides immense comfort and security. But bridging developing relationships with external non-immigrant communities, that requires conscious effort and confronting all the complexities of a diverse society.
So the skill set that makes a Japanese person succeed flawlessly in Tokyo, mastering tatemae, reading the air, avoiding confrontation, is the very thing that severely handicaps them when they encounter blunt, high-context American society where they're expected to name their offense.
That is the core difficulty. The Japanese immigrant relies on a cultural structure where direct communication of offense is avoided at all costs. This is why a study targeting Japanese female immigrants in Boston focused on teaching awareness of microaggressions.
A concept that doesn't really exist in Japan.
The concept of microaggression, these subtle, often unintentional acts of discrimination, is largely undeveloped and untranslated in Japan because of the collective low-context culture. They just lack the social vocabulary to process the discomfort they're experiencing.
And the findings of that study, they clearly showed how hard it is to translate that awareness into active bridging.
Absolutely. The pre-workshop data showed a staggering 48% of attendees had never even heard of the term microaggression. After the workshop, 100% understood its influence better. The cognitive shift was a success.
But could they act on it?
The move to action was nearly non-existent. Only 5% indicated they could immediately take an action based on what they learned. It just demonstrates the immense psychological struggle required to overcome decades of cultural training that demands silence and avoidance of direct conflict.
Yet they clearly found strength in their internal group.
They did. When asked, 68% strongly agreed that it was important to learn with their community members. They were relying heavily on bonding internal group support when confronting external social issues. Their natural, culture-instilled tendency, when faced with the challenges of the soto, the outside world, is to retreat to the comfort and safety of the uchi, the in-group. It confirms the enduring power of those structures, even across continents. So if we synthesize all of this, using the lenses of historical institutionalism and identity politics, the profound political divergence that define the modern era becomes crystal clear. Europe, shattered by WWII, developed a strong consensus against extreme nationalism,
which led them to the EU.
It led to the institutionalization of cooperation, which forced them to adopt policies that necessitated managing diverse populations.
While Japan, insulated by its unique post-war labor conditions, used the reconstruction to strengthen its insular nationalism.
Exactly. The political and social structures dominated by the LDP and fortified by these cultural narratives of homogeneity allowed Japan to maintain its restrictive policies. They prioritized domestic solutions, even the failed attempts to boost birth rates over any meaningful inclusion of foreign labor, which would challenge their core identity narrative.
And we see the practical consequence of this choice in current policy. Despite the acute need for labor, Japan's gates remain locked, especially for unskilled labor, because of that fundamental immovable line.
The Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act from 1951 is still the foundation of this rigidity. Even when they try to make changes, they fall short. The Specified Skilled Worker Visa, the SSW, it was intended to bring in needed foreign labor, but it's attracted far fewer workers than they anticipated.
Just a fraction of the target.
Only around 22,500 visa holders as of early 2021. The policies prioritize short-term, tightly controlled migration like the technical intern training program rather than permanent settlement. This reflects the deep societal hesitation to truly embrace migrants as integral to the Japanese nation. It's a functional rejection of integration.
Meanwhile, the European path, for all its issues, has at least institutionalized a pathway for permanent change.
Germany's evolution from the temporary Gastarbeiter program eventually necessitated profound institutional adaptation. This led to the 2000 Citizenship Reform and the 2005 Immigration Act, which sought to create more inclusive ways of defining identity and citizenship, acknowledging that the demographic shift was permanent.
And France?
France used policy to encourage assimilation. It often resulted in tension, but crucially, their institutional framework allows for the recognition of permanent populations with diverse cultural identities.
So this brings us back to the central strategic trade-off. Japan has consciously chosen to pay an enormous economic cost to preserve its social and cultural structures.
This is the final analysis. Japan's decision to maintain its immovable line is a strategic trade-off. It's a functional rejection of globalist economic principles. They accept the profound economic realities, massive public debt, prolonged economic stagnation, a shrinking workforce, as the necessary cost to protect their cultural integrity and, most critically, their high-trust, low-mobility equilibrium. They view the flexibility and blurring of boundaries they see elsewhere not as progress, but as symptoms of decay leading to disorder.
So we have completed the deep dive into Japan's psychological Great Wall. We've seen how the country's unyielding nature, built on these deeply ingrained cultural concepts and reinforced by institutional path dependency functions as this psychological fortress against the social chaos we often associate with high mobility and diversification. We've examined the staggering costs this rigidity exacts, a demographic crisis and prolonged economic stagnation. Yet we have to acknowledge that this strategy successfully maintains a remarkably high level of internal social trust and order, the kind of order that guarantees a wallet left on the subway bench will be returned. This order, built on that non-negotiable line, is the ultimate asset Japan has chosen to defend.
This strategic choice, it really forces us to look beyond simple economic and demographic calculations. If Japan's chosen path is indeed a model for an elegant decline, it is one that's predicated on sacrificing economic scale for the preservation of cultural and social integrity. This approach confronts us with the ultimate value proposition of boundaries. We've laid out the evidence, from the cultural mandates of hon-ne and tatemae to the data showing legal residents are more law-abiding than citizens, demonstrating the immense cost and the equally profound, if subtle, benefit of choosing the immovable line. The Japanese choice forces us to ask, what is the highest price you would be willing to pay, in debt, in demographic decline, in global influence, to guarantee that fundamental simple trust? The social contract they maintain, where the wallet is always returned, is the profound anchor for their civilization.